right. Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day for this important and timely webinar. I'm excited to have invited several subject matter experts from the field of wildfire preparedness. With me they'll be sharing information and several resources that will help you feel better prepared for wildfire season this year and in the future. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that today's presentation will have time devoted to a question and answer. This is a Zoom webinar, which means there is a Q&A feature that you can use to pose your questions, and please do so. We carved out a lot of time so that this presentation and information can really be tailored to what you're looking for and what you're needing. My name is Karina McIntyre. I'm from the Regional School Safety Center, and I am the moderator for today. We have several learning objectives. So today, participants will learn wildfire prevention and mitigation strategies, including how to harden structures from ember ignitions and create defensible space. You'll also learn what each of those terms mean. You'll also learn how to respond during a wildfire, including evacuation basics, and we'll be covering what resources are available for recovery efforts after a fire. So with me today, we have regional experts as part of our panel. Each of them are going to give an overview from their role and from their perspective, which will queue us up for the Q&A afterwards. So I have Michael McNorville, who's from the Underwood Conservation District, Charlie Landsman, who's from the Department of Natural Resources, Barb Ayers, who's from the Skamania County Emergency Management, and Jason Judd, who's from the Southwest Washington chapter of the American Red Cross. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Michael, and I will put myself on mute.
Hey, good afternoon, folks. Thanks so much for joining us towards the end of the day on a Tuesday. Wednesday? Is it Wednesday today, finally? My name is Michael McNorville. I am the Forest Health and Wildfire Resilience Coordinator here at Underwood Conservation District. And our objective as a conservation district is to provide technical assistance to landowners for the most part. We do voluntary conservation assistance, which can look like a couple of things. It can look like fuels reduction projects, it can look like forest health projects, it can look like stream habitat improvement, it can look like farm planning, agriculture. We tackle it all. So for this particular webinar, I, as the forest and fire guy, was asked to take a crack at giving some background on wildfire in our community, in our region. Before I get into that, though, I have a couple questions for you all that I'd like you to think about. The first is, we see the after effects of something like the Williams Mine Fire in the bottom right of the screen here, or for me, driving along the Columbia Gorge back in 2017 while the Eagle Creek Fire was burning, is a core memory at this point, both beautiful and destructive and all the things. So I'd really like to get some input from folks who are in attendance. Firstly, what is good fire? And secondly, what does good fire look like? What does a fire resilient landscape look like, particularly where you work, the schools that you work at, where they're located? What does a good fire or a fire resilient landscape look like in those areas? And I'll give 30 seconds for people to think about.
And go ahead, I believe you should be able to pop your answers into the chat. And if the chat feature is not working, I'm not able to hear from anybody because everybody's on mute. So fingers crossed.
Oh,
The chat
great.
feature is
Yeah,
not working.
chat feature is
It's not
not
working.
working. All
Okay,
right.
thank you.
So whatever answers y'all have developed in your brains, that's awesome. I think about these questions specifically because I want to integrate, or I want to help folks integrate multiple objectives into the way that they view their forests or their communities or their residential areas. And thinking about how these communities exist in an area that has adapted to and co-evolved with the presence of fire for thousands and thousands of years. So we can probably go to the next slide here. A little bit of an overview on fire in the Pacific Northwest. We've got two pretty distinct, what's called fire regimes, or sort of long-term patterns of the way that fire occurs on the landscape. And in the West, we have this pretty densely vegetated, high fuel content, high rain, boom and bust systems that will sort of explode with fire every couple hundred of years, whereas on the east side we have a fire regime that is a bit more frequent, a bit lower fuel loads. So the fires that do go through there, at least historically, tend to be a little bit lower in intensity, tend to be that more open and park-like sort of forest structure. But Fire on the Landscape provides many different services, including encouraging fire-adapted plants to grow, including these huckleberries on the west side, or camas root on the east side of the Cascades, or even just providing openings for ungulates like deer and elk to be able to forage for the necessary resources. So fire, in many ways, is a good thing and has existed on the landscape for many centuries. We can go to the next one. So I think it's good to start off with how a fire actually works, and how we as fire scientists and forest scientists often look at fire as what's called the fire triangle, because often it takes three disparate but coexisting factors to create something like a flame, a fire, or long-term fire behavior. So in this case, we have the fire triangle, which answers the question, how does a fire start? So there's three things you need for a fire start. You need fuel, and I think, Karina, if you click on the next one, you might get a transition. So on the west side of the Cascades, we have pretty dense vegetation, like I said, so we've got a ton of fuel. And if you click next, this is as compared to the east side of the Cascades, where you've got pretty low growing grasses, maybe some taller shrubs, but ultimately these trees are not existing with a substantial connection between ground fuels and those canopy fuels. So we've got these two different types of ecosystems that we're dealing with on either side of the Cascades. In terms of ignition sources, you can click next there, Karina. We also have two different ignition regimes. On the east side, we see far more natural ignitions and lightning strikes than on the west side. On the west side, we're more likely to see ignitions caused by campfires, by human activity, even something like fireworks. So for your kids that you're working with, make sure they're leaving the fireworks at home in fire-prone areas. You can click next, Karina. So beyond that, we talk about what the fire would actually look like. The flame started because it had the oxygen that was available, which is always available. It had the fuel that was available, and it had an ignition source. Now we get to the more broad fire triangle, which is influenced again by fuel. So if you click next, Karina. Oh, well, actually, we'll start with weather. So it's influenced by weather, and there's three things that really have to come together in order for a fire to really pick up speed. We need pretty recent droughty conditions where there isn't a ton of water content in the fuels that are potentially being burned. We need hotter temperatures that continue to dry out those fuels, and also allow for higher likelihood of ignition. And then the last thing that really spurs these fire patterns is wind, and especially here in the Columbia Gorge, that can be a huge factor in the acceleration of size of acreage burned for our fires. So you think about the Eagle Creek fire, the Tunnel 5 fire, the Williams Mine fire. Often those fires had days of intense fire, or excuse me, intense wind currents that drove fire to grow pretty substantially within a few hours, maybe a few days. Next up, we have, I believe, fuel. Yep. And so when we think about fuel in terms of how a fire is going to behave, we're really thinking about how that fuel is structured. Is it dense? Is it not dense? Do we see a lot of vertical continuity? So tall grasses leading to taller shrubs, leading to the lower branches of trees? Is there a lot of horizontal continuity between tree canopies? This stuff can add up to determining whether or not something stays as a surface fire, sort of crawling its way around these low growing fuel sources versus getting up into the canopy and producing these really intense flame lengths because they're torching and engulfing all these trees. So figuring out what kind of fuel structure you have on your land, whether you're in a forest or whether that's on your school grounds, making sure that your school grounds are mitigated so that there isn't a ton of vertical and horizontal fuel continuity is a really good idea. And then last up here is topography. If your school's on a steep slope, you got to remember that fire will barrel its way uphill because as heat rises, it tends to preheat fuels in front of it. And so you're getting this preheating phase that will accelerate the way that fire moves up a hill and will also cause these rolling pieces of debris that may be on fire to roll down a hill. So you're getting sort of a double whammy there with fire accelerating uphill and then debris that could potentially provide an ignition source flowing downhill as well. And we can go on to the next one. And finally, and this is the one that we're really concerned about. It's the regime. It's how is fire historically present on the landscape, and then of course how is that changing given changing climatic conditions on the landscape. And so if you click next, the first thing that we're looking at is, again, that vegetation. Is it more of that west side super dense forest, lots of fuels accumulating in these forests versus the east side, pretty sparse. You still have some fuels, some patches of dense fuel, but for the most part, we're sticking with a pretty sparse forest, at least historically. And there might be the last thing. Yeah, this is what we're seeing. So over the past century of both fire suppression and other management tactics, we've seen overstocking or an over densification of especially our east side forests. So these forests that were adapted for thousands of years to having not a ton of fuel on the forest floor, not a ton of tree density. Suddenly there is a lot of tree density because a lot of those trees weren't allowed to burn during lower intensity fires during this period of fire suppression. And so what you end up with, and really what we're trying to move away from, are these instances of uncharacteristic and highly severe wildfire, which could happen in a forest or they could be spread structure to structure during a structural ignition. So that top right corner, that Carlton Complex picture of just a whole stand of East Side Forest being pretty much decimated by a high intensity fire that killed off most of those trees. We're trying to avoid big patches of that, but unfortunately we're seeing that more and more as conditions continue to change on the ground. And so the big thing that this means to us as structural ignition avoiders or trying to avoid structural ignition, trying to mitigate our structures, is knowing that 80% of structures lost, no matter the kind of wildfire event, those are mostly going to be coming from an ignition by windblown embers. So it's not necessarily that moving fire front that's going to consume most of the anthropogenic structural material. It's really those embers that are being produced by a wildfire that may travel for several hundred yards, maybe even several miles before they land in a litter or debris pile, ignite that pile, and suddenly start to spread to a structure. And so when we think about defensible space, or what has been updated to be called the structural ignition zone, when we're looking at avoiding fires in that structural ignition zone, the first thing we're thinking about is, okay, where can embers land? Where can litter accumulate? And where can they combine to produce an ignition that could take out a structure? So the first thing to do is really separate out your area around the structures. And most of the time we're working with homes, but this absolutely applies for school structures, administrative buildings as well. We're thinking about the area about 100, maybe 100 feet around each of these structures and thinking, okay, what are the different techniques that we can deploy in each of these areas to really limit the risk of fire spread to the structure itself and consumption of that structure from fire. So we split the defensible space zone or the structural ignition zone into three different areas. We've got the immediate area. That's really the structure and about the first 5 feet from the structure that we say, it's the immediate zone, and that's where you want most of your immediate action to take place as close to the structure as possible. We want this area to be non-combustible and free from as much vegetation and dead litter and other potential fuels as possible. And for the structures themselves, ideally, we'd like to see the building materials that those structures are made out of being ignition resistant. We're talking about Class A ignition resistant building materials like asphalt composite roofs, maybe even metal roofs, hardy board siding or other fiber composites, Trex deck boards, that kind of thing. As you go out from 5 feet, around 30 feet, this is what is really known as the careful landscaping zone, where you can have some vegetation. It doesn't necessarily need to be fuel free, but we're still paying a lot of mind to the way that those fuels are structured on the landscape, especially vertical fuels. Those vertical fuels, creating those fuel ladders is really bad news bears in a lot of instances, because when you see a tree torch, when you feel the heat coming off of it, you'll see the taller the fuel, the more intense the flames coming off of it. And so as much as we can do to prevent fire spread from the surface to vertical fuels like a tree, or even like a tall building, the better. And then we also are looking at horizontal continuity. How easy is it for fire to spread from one tree to another? And how far a spacing do we need between canopies in this intermediate zone? In the extended zone, this is kind of the the zone that you don't want to eliminate fire from, because it might take quite a bit of investment in terms of time and in terms of resources. But really what this zone is good for, 30 to 100, maybe 100 feet out from a structure, is interrupting fire's path and keeping flame lengths as small as possible, which also inherently includes keeping them on the ground if you can, really interrupting as many of those vertical fuels as possible and making sure that if a fire does move through your area, it's moving along the ground, if at all, if there's fuels to consume. And otherwise, if you've got a lot of pavement, a lot of hardscaping, hopefully you don't have to worry too much about fire moving in that kind of environment. And I think this last slide for me is going to be really a quick checklist of, okay, we're discussing structural ignition zones. What does that really mean on the face of it? And here's a pretty simple checklist that you can start with. What are the building materials looking like? Are they non-combustible? Are you able to install those non-combustible building materials, including on roofs, including on siding, including fences around school grounds or around administrative buildings? What can we take that is currently ignitable, made of wood or some sort of untreated, meltable, ignitable material, and switch it over to something unignitable? Next is applying hardscaping buffers, and that's really in accordance with that fuel-free area that we like to see immediately surrounding structures. And the best way to do that is to apply what we call hardscaping. So that's putting down something like cement, like gravel, like paving stones, something unignitable that can be placed directly around these structures, on top of what's around the structures, on the structures themselves. What are your potential entrances for embers? How many vents do you have? What do the vents look like? Are they open pretty wide? Are they screened? How big is the screening? All of these things are things that we think about when we do defensible space assessments and when we're looking at structural ignition zones. Cleaning debris around these structures. Again, the most effective things you can do are the things closest to the structures themselves. So cleaning debris, including needles, broad leaves, moss that is growing on roofs, sticks that are dropping from trees, all those things that could potentially ignite, if you can remove those from roofs, from gutters, at least once during the summer, if not more frequently, you're doing a lot to turn the dial down on the litter accumulation and potential areas of ember ignition. Tree branches, a lot of people are concerned about tree branches as well. These you can mitigate by trimming away from structures or up as high above structures as you can, leaving sort of a fuel-free bubble around a structure, so that even in the event that close piece of vegetation, that tree, that piece of brush, even if that does ignite, you're mitigating as much as possible, so that the fire does not spread from that vegetation to your structures. Next up is reducing fuel heights. Like I said, the taller a piece of fuel is that gets ignited, the more intense those flames that are coming off of it are going to be, very generally. And so if you can reduce the fuel heights of understory plants, of your shrubs, prune up your lower branches of your trees to interrupt those ladder fuels, you're really doing a lot to decrease the potential intensity of any sort of fire that rolls through your landscape. And then you repeat this for all buildings. It's not just a home structure that we look at, even on residential properties. We're looking at barns, workshops, wood storage, and the same goes for campus grounds. We're looking at the ignitability of each of these separate structures and doing what we can to hopefully mitigate those structures against fire each individually, and then hopefully as the compendium will produce a more wildfire ready and more wildfire prepared campus for you all. And I think that's all I have in terms of just the individual basis. I'm going to pass it over to Charlie from the Department of Natural Resources to continue on.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. As was mentioned, my name is Charlie Landsman. I am a Community Resilience Coordinator with Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I cover Klickitat and Skamania County within your folks' territory, as well as 6 other counties east of here. And then I have a coworker, Mark Titus, who is the Community Resilience Coordinator just to the west of here, as well as 6 other CR coordinators around the rest of the state. So no matter where you're at in the state, you do have coverage by one of us. And I would encourage you to reach out, see what different programs we have that could assist you in your fire mitigation efforts. But the big topic that I wanted to talk about today is really moving from that individual scale, like Michael was talking about, to more of that community scale. What can you do, or how can you participate in creating a fire adapted community? And with that, a fire adapted community is really just a community that acknowledges and actively works to reduce their wildfire risk. So there's not a strict, you have to do X, Y, Z. It's different for every community, and the specific steps that need to be taken in every community are going to vary greatly. But there's really 5 main principles that we can focus on when thinking about what we need to do to create that fire adapted community. And the first one is that built environment. What are we putting on the landscape? And so there's that personal aspect, like Michael was talking about, of homes and garages and buildings. But there's also that community aspect of power lines and gas lines and other utilities, and maybe a pump house for a well, or even all of our schools, which are those major community assets. And in many of the places that we work, they're one of the only community focused buildings in the entire area. So making sure that we're doing as much as possible to protect all of that different built environment. And that's where really it comes down to both that hardening that Michael was talking about, is making sure that our all of our stuff is built in a way that's going to be resistant to wildfire. So he mentioned that defensible space aspect a lot, but also maybe underlining power lines is something that will both potentially reduce ignitions, as well as ensure that power can be kept on during a wildfire, so that the pump houses can continue to pump water so that the fire hydrants work. With that, maybe it makes sense to put in, backup power to some of those places, so that similarly we can still have electricity, so that we can get water or whatever communication information both in and out of that community, in order to make sure that everybody there is staying up to date on information, as well as those first responders. It's really about both building resilience into our infrastructure, as well as creating that defensible space around those critical pieces of infrastructure, in order to offer the most protection possible for that community, as well as for the first responders coming in there. And with that, we go to that community protection aspect. And so a lot of what we look at with community protection is fuel breaks. That's doing these large scale fuel treatments around the entire communities so that when a fire moves into that community, it's going to immediately drop down in intensity, move along the ground rather than continue through the crowns, the tops of the trees, large scale into that community. With that, you can't just do one without doing the other, where Michael mentioned that embers ignite approximately 80% of homes. If you just create a fuel break, those embers are still going to be going past that fuel break. And if you don't create the defensible space, then they're either going to ignite that structure directly, or they're going to increase, that fire is going to increase in intensity again once it surpasses that fuel break, especially if there's not firefighters there to suppress that fire. And then a lot of what we deal with is access as well. How can you get in and out of a community? Lots of our folks, especially in more rural areas, they have a single bridge into that community or one road in and out, where if something happens to that bridge, or if there's a vehicle accident along that road, or if a tree comes down along that road, you might no longer be able to get in and out of that community. So we will look at how can we ensure that there's secondary egress, ingress, and egress. Also, if it's a one lane road up to the school or up to a home within that community, do we need to add pullouts or turnarounds so that fire trucks can turn around? Luckily with the schools, most of the time, since they have buses and other large vehicles coming in and out, they're going to be set up really, really, really well for our emergency vehicles to be able to access them. But that doesn't mean that going back to the tree falling across the road or the one way in and out of the entire community, that's not still an issue that needs to be addressed with our communities. And then finally, there's the evacuation access of what evacuation steps do we have in place to make sure that we can get folks out during a large scale wildfire. There are times where those fires are so fast moving and so powerful and have so much fuel behind them that it really is trying to push that fire a certain direction or trying to get people out of the way of that fire, more so than going and doing direct attack on the front of that fire. And so depending on where a fire starts and under what conditions, evacuations are going to be the best bet to make sure that we're getting everybody to safety so that we can really allow those firefighters to then focus on taking on that fire where they have a chance of actually catching it or actually stopping it. So I think we can jump to the next slide, where one of the programs that I work with extensively is the FireWise USA program. It is designed specifically for small communities, and so this might not be relevant to every single one of you based on where you live or where you work, but it is something that the general concept is still valid across all of our communities. And so one of the things that we always focus on doing is trying to have a committee or a board, folks within that community who are really focused on wildfire mitigation and prevention. And the reason for that is you all have relationships within a community that I don't. And it's really important to lean onto those trusted folks within a community to be some of the primary conveyors of information within there, because you are that trusted person within your community. So it's really key for us to have those contacts within a community to help guide our actions and our mitigation steps and figure out what's going to be the most important and most critical steps to take within that community. We also will offer to do things like a community assessment. We have a template where we can go in and we can look through an entire community and create basically a plan to identify all of the hazards within that community, as well as create that action plan of what steps and prioritize what steps that community as a whole should take. There will always be things in there about creating defensible space and structure hardening and getting in evacuation information out to folks, but there's also more specific steps like maybe we do need to identify where a secondary egress road is going to go. Maybe we do need to identify which direction a fire is most likely to come from based on topography and wind, and do a fuels treatment on that side of the community. It really is key for us to get eyes on the ground, go into that community and identify those hazards. And it's really key for that committee or board to give feedback to us of what does that community really want to focus on and what steps are going to be most well received within that community. So we can sometimes start with that and then later transition to some different things that take a little bit more time to get up and running. With the FireWise USA program specifically, it does also require an actual commitment towards doing that work. And we've seen that in a couple of communities where the school has been influential in helping get us into that community. In Glenwood, for example, I know Michael and Karina and I went out there last year, and based on some of the interest that was stirred up from that visit, we're actually starting our small fire adapted communities group out in Glenwood now. So the schools can really be a great way for us to get into that community for that first push to then take those next steps. And then for the program itself, there is an application, but for most of you working, from that school perspective, we probably wouldn't be going after this specific program, but the framework behind it is still extremely valuable, and the community that those schools are in still can go for that specific recognition status. So jumping to the next slide, there's a lot of funds available. I know that most things in the world, it's one of the constants is capacity and funding are two things I always hear about why things aren't happening. And it's true, there are barriers there, but there's also a lot of resources there. And so a couple of specific ones that you can work with is working with local organizations like the conservation district that Michael works for, nonprofits. In a big part of Klickitat County in specific, we have Mount Adams Resource Stewards, a nonprofit that is putting in large fuel breaks and doing a lot of fuels reduction work and has chipper programs. Also, a lot of fire departments will have chipper programs, or they'll have firefighters who can come and partner with schools to come and do potentially work for free on the ground or at a discounted rate. There's also a cost share program that DNR has itself, where we can come out to a property, we can lay out a large fuel reduction project and pay for a portion of the cost of implementing that prescription. So reach out to either your community resilience coordinator or to your service forester, the service foresters are going to be the ones who manage that cost share program, and they can help lay that project out for you and help you get into that program to help do fuels reduction work. There's also some other federal programs like NRCS EQIP, which is a program to similarly do those large scale fuel reduction treatments. There's things like the CWDG, or Community Wildfire Defense Grant. I will apologize, I use a lot of acronyms, as I think many of us do, so I'll try to go back over those. The NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and then that CWDG is the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. That is a U.S. Forest Service grant that goes towards some sort of project that is listed in a community wildfire protection plan, which is essentially a county-wide plan like that Firewise community assessment and action plan that I mentioned in the previous slide. So you can help put in larger fuel breaks, you can do dry hydrants or add water resources to a community. You can do a lot of different things with that funding that will help reach those fire adapted communities goals. And then there's also, or I should update this slide because that BRIC grant was actually removed last week, I believe, but there are still some funds out there for infrastructure improvements. So when we talked about, undergrounding power lines or increasing access through secondary egress routes, there are funds out there on the federal level that can help with that. But one grant that I really like, because it's one that I manage, is the Firewise USA micro grant through DNR. So we can give $4,000 to a community to do some sort of community-oriented project to help reduce wildfire risk. With those schools being such a critical piece of our infrastructure and such a community group, we oftentimes will use them to have some sort of fuels reduction program on their grounds if possible. So if we can set up a chipper program or dumpster programs where we can use their parking lot, we will pay for the chipping and removal of the dumpsters, but then folks can cut that vegetation around their property, they can drop it off at a centralized location, and we will pay to get rid of it. But it takes those partnerships and those locations in order to make it happen. We've also paid for signage, we've paid for mailers, we've paid for lots of different things through that grant. It's pretty wide open and it's available to help you in your communities. So if folks have any questions about any of these, I'd encourage them to reach out to me directly. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. With that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Barbara, I believe.
Barb, you're on mute.
How's that? I was just talking to myself. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I'm a county emergency manager for Skamania County. We're here in the Gorge, but the same is true all across the nation. Whatever state you're in, there is at least one county emergency manager. And our job is to think about what are all the things a community needs to do to prepare before, during, and after a disaster. I've worked in 3 states and worked for large and small counties. And I love small counties best because I feel like we're kind of scrappy and we're creative and we work together really well. So next slide, please. One of the things I'm particularly concerned about, and hopefully this is on your radar screen. Of course, you've already heard we're in a high wildfire hazard area. When I was in Oregon as an emergency manager, a thing called PSPS, Public Safety Power Shutoff, started to come into the community. And they're already talking about it coming in here in Washington. Why that's a huge impact is, if you can imagine, these are proactive utility cutoffs. The fire hasn't happened yet. But it's the kind of conditions that could create a large wildfire. It's windy, it's hot, the humidity is low, everything's bone dry. When we're at that risk, it's usually a red flag time. And in the future, and in some communities now, utilities are shutting off the power, so there isn't a utility caused fire. So that's something else we need to be thinking about as we plan for emergencies. But I'm here to tell you, even if that doesn't happen, almost all the time when there is a wildfire, there definitely will be power outages, usually because either, again, they'll proactively turn it off, or because maybe some of the poles are damaged or there's some other damage that occurs. Also, you can have clogged roads. And many times in these emergencies, there's a boil water notice. That doesn't sound like a big deal, or maybe you know it is, but it could be pretty catastrophic for a school. It affects restaurants, anybody that's preparing food. There's just a lot of ways that it can kind of complicate the already problematic fire. Next slide, please. So this is the thing that we have to really think about. In a moment, everything can change. Here's just a couple slides from recent incidents. In my experience, it always happens when you least expect it or you least want it to happen. We'll talk in a minute about the Eagle Creek fire, but it's usually like the middle of the night, or it's on a weekend, or it's just a totally inopportune time. But immediately the communications can be very challenging. A lot of times cell phones are loaded up and you can't call people. You might be able to text, but communications and getting good quality information is really hard because these things are changing so fast. And understandably, everybody's out there fighting the fire or closing roads, and may not be the first priority to also, get the message out. We'll talk in a little bit about alerts in an incident. But the big thing I think most about is transportation. We can be cut off from each other. You could be at school with kids, and now you're immediately going to have to maybe shelter them in place or figure out how to reunify them with their families. Your own personal family may be in a different spot than you, right? So you could be separated. You might have kids in another school. So you can see where in a situation like this, it could be really challenging. Families can be separated. Next slide, please. Charlie mentioned this. This is something that keeps me awake at night. Absolutely, out here in the Gorge in particular, we have so few roads, and we have these 2 choke points, which are these interstate bridges across Oregon to Washington. But I've worked for big and small counties, and in my experience, even the big metro areas can have really problems with getting in and out, and that's because they may have a ton more roads, but they also have a ton more people. So out here where we are, we have very limited roads, but we have a smaller population. That said, in the Gorge, a big concern for us is tourism. We'll have a lot of people here in our national forests. We have people out on the water, downtown in our beautiful, business district. So you can see those numbers are pretty amazing. Not only the tourists that come here to the Gorge, but also look at that I-84 traffic. It's like 12 million a year. I mean, that's a lot of people with these very few roads and bridges. Now, you may be in a bigger area, but really be thinking about that. What are the choke points for you in your district? Next slide, please. So one of the things we're working on really hard right now is preliminary evacuation planning countywide. So we're responsible pretty much for the people, right? residents, people that are here part-time, those tourists that I mentioned. There's all kinds of people to think about. First responders getting in and out, seasonal workers. How about the supply chain? In a small community like ours, our grocery stores can get out of, and fueling can be cut off from the outside world. So all these things are really important. And I think my big go-to for you is, if school's in session, we're counting on you to take care of your students. And if you're not in session, we really might need your help. You hear more about that in a minute. Next slide. Okay, so our focus, like I said, is kind of, and this should be your focus too. Maybe you've already thought about it, how to get in and out. Charlie kind of mentioned this. What are the alternates? So we've been starting to map all this. We're looking at evacuation routes, and then we're creating zones around those routes, because when we issue evacuation warnings, we want to target that area, and we want to give them good info on how to get out and where to go. So the second thing we're thinking about is a safe meeting place. So if the roads are clogged and you can't get all the way out to where you want to go, are there some parking lots? It might be a school. It might be, a pull off, or like the port parking lot, something like that. And where are the emergency shelters going to be? We also, of course, map other things on there, but the thing I kind of worry about for you is the two things. You could either be a shelter in place for your students, or your school buses or your school may be needed either as an evacuation shelter or to help us evacuate other residents, hopefully, if you're out of school. So just a couple things to think about that we'd be looking for help from you if possible. Next slide. So I hope everybody's familiar with, and if you're not, this is probably the most important thing we can do, is to educate staff, students, families. Everybody needs to know this ready, set, go. You can see there are 3 colors. There's 3 levels. So level 1 is be ready, right? That means, wow, there's something coming and it could happen. Level 2 is be set. And that is, we might give you a notice with 5-minute warning for you to evacuate. Level 3 is go now, you're in imminent danger. And you can see that corresponds on the right side there. That's an evacuation map when I was working on this fire. You can see the green is be ready. Yellow is be set. So my house was in that area for 2 weeks. So that's something else to think about. It's not like you're in and out in 2 hours. It could go on for days and possibly weeks. And you can see that level 3 area is go now. So ready, set, go, 1, 2, 3, green, yellow, red. We really, really need people to understand that. Next slide, please. Okay, these levels can change in a moment. So this is, I worked for Hood River, Oregon. I was their emergency manager and the EOC manager for the Eagle Creek wildfire. Very fast moving, long-term, huge incident. You can see that red zone down there in Cascade Locks. Those people in the middle of the night got at 4 a.m., get out now. Luckily, we had thought about it before, so they crossed the Bridge of the Gods, went over to Washington, and interestingly enough, we took them here in Stevenson and evacuated. All the people that evacuated came to our side of the river. So don't let that river or that state line throw you. Be thinking about where you potentially could go. And you can see those kind of zones, A4, A5. Those are the zones that we could send an alert to say, okay, you're level 1, be ready. So I think the most important thing here is things can change really quickly. And in my experience as an evacuee, people see that green or that get ready and they go, oh, I'm fine. The problem is Cascade Locks had a level 3, middle of the night. And then like 3 minutes later, it went to go now. So you don't take for granted that those things you're going to have lots of time in between those switches. It might take some time, but oftentimes they change really rapidly. Next slide. So my message to you, your school, your staff, your families is don't hesitate, evacuate. I think the worst thing that could happen is if you wait too long, you're either going to be in trouble, the roads will be clogged. I just really worry about what happens if people wait to the last minute. And I've just seen this over and over. So if you're that man there, that's my neighbor in Mosier. I was evacuated. You'll hear about that in a minute. Time kind of stands still and your stress level is very high. You don't think very clearly. And this is a really good time to be thinking about your community members, your neighbors. Do you have a senior that lives nearby? Same thing at school. Who needs extra time if we're going to evacuate? Next slide. So I'm all about disaster preparedness. Of course, we're talking about wildfires, but I was just out of state and had a big earthquake rattle the windows off the house yesterday when I was out of town. Of course, we know we can have strong winters, and we have volcanoes in our area. So again, we really need people to really be thinking about how to prepare for this kind of thing. Getting, you'll hear about the Go Kit and the family plan and all that fun stuff. But again, at home and at work, are your neighbors prepared? Are all our communities, are they thinking about it? And your students' families, also your staff's families. How effective is your staff going to be if they're worried about their family, who they're separated from, that just got evacuated? Next slide. I think the most important thing people can do is sign up for county emergency alerts. Every county across the nation has this. This is ours. The QR code, you can hit that and sign up if you're in Skamania. These emergency alerts are tied to an address. So you go in and you sign up. I'm Barbara Ayers. I live in Mosier, Oregon, and I work in Stevenson, Washington. I'll sign up for both alerts for both of those sites. You could do it for family members. I did it for my folks' house, my brother's house, that kind of thing. So these are based on where you live. I know schools also have their own alerting tools, but just be aware if it's not a school time, or we need everybody to be opted in, not to replace your system, but to augment it. And one other piece that you've probably heard about that we can send out is called a WEA, or a wireless emergency alerts. And those are, they go to your cell phone directly. So they don't know where you live. They just know that you're within the tower area. And those are another alert thing to go out. They're like an Amber Alert, right? I'm sure you've gotten one of those before. Next slide. So we have a page here. You don't have to go to my page, but there's plenty of great info out there. I have all these PDFs you can download. It's got a family emergency plan. It's got a pet preparedness. I've got some of Michael and Charlie's, defensible space stuff, how to make a Go Kit, fun stuff. But anyway, you can follow that QR code if you want. Thanks. So on the family disaster plan, again, this is that what if situation. What if you're at school and something happens? And it may be at school, or it might be affecting your family at home, or some of your students' families at home, or your staff's. So how are they going to get reconnected? How will you stay in touch if cell service is down? And what if those roads are clogged? What if the power goes out? Now what? I mean, if that takes out your Wi-Fi, now you're not on your laptop. You might be, your battery on your cell phone might be running down. And then what about seniors or people that need extra time? Next slide. So if is there a magic solution? It's an unfortunate situation, but in my experience, there is a magic solution. First of all, number one, hats off to Red Cross. Most of the time they will open an emergency shelter with your local county right away. So there's a place for people to go. So you'll get an emergency alert that says wildfire moving quickly. Folks in this area need to evacuate now, or it'll be like, get ready, get set. And they'll identify a shelter or a place to go. And oftentimes we'll also put out what's called a TEP, or a temporary evacuation point. That's kind of a safe staging area. But above and beyond that, in the Eagle Creek fire, we found over there on the right, camping and trailers. If folks have RVs or camp, you're set. In my opinion, that's the best thing you can do for preparedness. At the Eagle Creek fire, there was a traditional 3-part shelter. We had a Red Cross shelter that was indoors. We had a pet shelter outside at the Skamania Fairgrounds. And then we also had a whole camping area where you could either camp in your tent or you could bring your trailer. And you could still access some of Red Cross's services. So it's kind of a good solution. Next slide. Okay, so what do those two slides have in common, right? On the right is your Go Kit, right? Put this kit together, make a kit, get ready. It's got all your stuff. You just grab it and you go. And on the left, that's your camping kit or your travel kit. The kit that mom packs up for the weekends to take the kids down to the beach. That's your instant Go Kit. So we need everybody to be thinking about this and making this happen. Oh, one other thing about this. Don't bury it in the garage. Make it easy to get to, easily accessible in an emergency. Next slide. Just a quick reminder. So after you grab your Go kit, I mean, I like to just think of the top 5 list of things that you have to take with you that you want to have. And that very 5th one there is that can take up all your time. You know, people go, oh, I need my wedding photos, or I need this. And I've done it. I did it my first time I evacuated. I took paintings off the wall. I did the whole deal. And the truth is you have very little time, and you really need to focus on the top 5. So anyway, next slide. And then I just like to have a little fun with this. I've always wanted to take my cat camping. Bottom line is animals are as affected, more affected by these emergencies. And so if you have pets in your family, you need to have a pet Go kit as well. And especially if same thing as having kids or seniors, if you have animals, we want to get people to evacuate early. You're going to be starting to pack up on level 1. You're going to be ready to roll at any minute in level 2. And in many times we ask people that are either medically fragile or need extra time to go at level 2. Don't wait till we say go now. Animals smell fire long before we do. And if you wait too long, those roads could be clogged. You might be hauling a horse trailer. And I just have to point out that funny picture in the middle. I don't know if you can tell what that is, but those are some clever person that evacuated their chickens in a hurricane, rolled them up in newspapers and put a little duct tape around it. And they were good to go. So very creative. Next slide. So this is my last slide, just what your county does for you, your county emergency manager. When we activate what's called the EOC, or the Emergency Operations Center, our job is to just get good information, send it out as quickly as we can. So typically we'll send it out to all of our stakeholders, schools, ports, any place where people come for information. So you have the information that we have. You know, we work with Red Cross. We're working on shelters and thinking about unmet community needs. Also, we play a key role in a recovery phase. So that wraps it up for me. I'd like to turn it over to Jason at Red Cross.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara. Hey, everyone. My name's Jason. I am a shelter coordinator for the Southwest Washington region, which kind of covers everyone here, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about what a shelter might look like if we did have to take over part of your school and house a bunch of people in it. And also just noting it may not be a school we may not be using a school. It could be a church or another identified building. But for the most part, particularly if it's summer and school's out, then we're looking for a lot of help from our school partners. So I'll just start by what is a Red Cross shelter? I guess I say it's more than just a shelter where people sleep. So it's actually a place for people to regroup. It's a bit of a refuge for people to get some respite from what's been going on around them. And also it's a hub for recovery services. Like Barbara mentioned, we will have people from the county there and hopefully other community services so people can get supplies and get information. And I've also just put on here what the Red Cross mission is, which is what we say. The American Red Cross prevents and alleviates human suffering in the face of emergencies by mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. And that's just to say that for the most part, our shelter staff are volunteers from your own community. So yeah, I guess a bit of a plug and a shout out. Always looking for new members of the team to help, particularly come summer. Yeah, and next slide, please. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so your school is probably already identified and pre-approved in county emergency plans as a sheltering site. So Red Cross will never unilaterally just say, we're going to open a shelter now. We do work with the counties and with fire services and everyone that we can to identify where a shelter would make most sense. There's no point in opening a shelter in an area that's going to get evacuated, things like that we do need to consider. And we do need to consider what's on at your school, for instance. We can't go and open a shelter if your school's in session and that is needed for other purposes. Now, we do have to look for some certain specific things as well. And obviously, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone individually about concerns or things you do or don't have in your schools. But we're looking for things like accessible restrooms. We need large indoor spaces, gyms, cafeterias, and we have some pretty strong requirements around different spaces that we need for sleeping and eating. And as does come up quite often, pets, horses, where are we going to put them? That's a big deal. Parking, how are we going to get emergency vehicles in and out, those kind of things. Next slide, please. And I also just think it's really important to point out here with Red Cross, a really key concept for us is universal access. So we do shelter anyone that's affected, regardless of race, gender, religion, immigration status, income, disability, or their housing situation as well. It's no secret that we will end up with a lot of people who, before the disaster, were unhoused or having issues with permanent housing. But that is, everyone is welcome in our shelters. And next slide, please. Cool. So I want to talk a little bit about what it would look like if one shelter were actually to be opened in your community. We can deploy within hours. So my job as the coordinator for Southwest Washington is to have people on the ground ready to go and work with you and your schools and the community to get that shelter open as soon as it needs to be. The hope, as Barbara said, is to have in that messaging out where people can go straight away. So we'll work to have that as quickly as possible. So what you can expect from us is that we're going to try and include a team that will include people who've got some at least basic mental health training, registered nurses, or at least access to them if we can get those, shelter managers and shelter workers. So what we provide directly are cots to sleep on, basic blankets, hygiene kits. We'll make sure that everyone gets 3 meals and snacks a day, and we'll make sure we try and have those specialists in for mental health and casework and things like that. And importantly for schools, I just want to make it clear that we don't expect schools and their staff to be running the shelter, or let's say a church as well. We don't expect that you would be running the day-to-day operations of the shelter. But it is obviously very beneficial if y'all understand what it is we're doing, and coordination is obviously key and very helpful. And we do want you to feel supported every step of the way, because it is a big deal and it can be very destabilizing for your staff and for students and the normal goings on in that school. Awesome. And the next slide. Excellent. So here we're just listing out a few of the different things that you can actually, the different areas that we can actually have in the shelters. They can be quite big operations. If it's going to depend on the community need. This list here that you're seeing on the screen is probably more relevant to a big stadium where we've got 2,000 people that are sheltering from a hurricane in Texas or something like that. But yeah, most of these functions will exist. We're always going to have somewhere for people to register, somewhere for people to sleep, and somewhere for people to eat. And very importantly too, we do like to make sure there's space for those other community partners and government partners to access, and for people to to become a bit of an information and focal point. And the next slide, please. And some of those specialized teams that we'll have there, hopefully, depending on the scale and the length of the time that it's open for, so disaster health services that can look after much more of, I guess, the physical needs of people. So we sometimes do have people that lose medications or have health concerns during evacuation. Mental health, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, that these big events can be quite taxing and quite tolling on individuals. Disaster spiritual care for those that need it or are looking for it. And in some cases, we will, particularly if a shelter is open for a long time, look for licensed childcare professionals as well, because often there's still residents of shelters who still need to go to work during the day and have children looked after, that kind of thing, particularly if school is out of session. Anyway, next slide, thank you. And just as an example, like we do need to maintain a few different separate areas in every shelter. So if you're thinking about how we might set your school up, like we will have that big dormitory, but then we've also got to have a snack and beverage area, a separate serving area and dining area. And these kind of things are important. One of the things we don't want to do is end up food poisoning anybody or anything silly like that. So just to manage people flow and food safety, we've got fairly strict requirements. And sometimes when I give you a call about opening a shelter, these are the things we might be considering, and that's why. Next slide. Awesome. This is just an example of, it's very simple, a dormitory setup. If we had a gym, it might look like that. We try and group our cots together, make sure we have an information desk. always water, access to charging phones and things like that, if we can. And we might further divide down those areas into, single men, family groups, that kind of thing, if we can. Excellent. And next slide. So once the immediacy of the evacuation's passed, I will honestly, as soon as we can, to be honest, we want to start the recovery phase with people who are in the shelter. So for some people, they're not going to need much. They might have evacuated and they can go home, and that's fantastic. For others, particularly if they've lost a house or something, it's going to get a lot more complex and complicated. So we hope to obviously have people like Barbara and the Skamania Academy in there to help us, or help people work out what the next step is. Sometimes we can work on reunification to try and reconnect families that have been separated. I think I mentioned before, helping families access housing, health, and financial resources. So people who come to shelters often come to shelters because they've got nowhere else to go. Sometimes that's because they're unhoused, or sometimes they were in insecure positions before, but we will work to make sure that we find pathways for everyone that is in the shelter. But like I said first, for the most part, people come for an evacuation and then leave, and most people can go home, and that's fantastic. In reality, I think it was, and I was talking to Barbara about it earlier, it's something like less than 1% of the evacuated people actually end up going to a shelter anyway. So it's not, we're not in this region looking at huge numbers from our recent past, but obviously that can change. If you have a big fire that hits a suburban area or something like that, we could have, that can all change in a heartbeat. So we just need to be prepared. Now, for schools specifically, the Red Cross does also a lot of work for resilience building after an event, and we do have our Preparedness with Pedro program, which is something we kind of like to plug here too. It's Pedro the Penguin, and it's something we can organize with local schools to go in and work with youth and just develop understanding and resilience, really, about building resilience in kids in the school communities. So if that's something that interests anybody, I might try and get a flyer thrown into the pack for you all to access after this meeting, or reach out to myself or anyone in my team. And the next slide. Yeah, so just in summary here, if your school becomes a shelter, you won't be alone. We really do rely on superintendents and administrators of schools, and everyone I've worked with last 5 seasons since I've been in this area has been fantastic. And we can do this if we all work together. Yes, it can be stressful, but it can also be exciting. Your schools are often such a heart of the community, so it's so good to be able to work with you and in your spaces as well. So again, and thanks for your efforts, and I do look forward to working. I hope I don't have to, but I do look forward to working with you with the upcoming season. And if there's anything more information that you need, or you're not really sure, or you need help developing plans for the future, then get into contact with me. I think my details will probably come out in the pack later, or Nora Mattingly. She's our department manager. And that would be me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. We are at the end of our time together today. Last check, I did not see any questions posted in the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, I will be sending out a follow-up email that will have contact information, as well as a whole bunch of resources that you can share with your schools, with your families and your staff, making sure that everybody in your school community can be better prepared. Thank you to each of you, each of our panelists, so much for your time and expertise today. We all really appreciate it, and your support and helping our schools feel better prepared. So have a good evening, everyone, and I will be emailing all of you probably first thing tomorrow morning. Take care. Have a good night. Bye-bye.